And joining us now, Demetrios Papademetriou, who is the president of the Migration Policy Institute. And we're grateful you spared some time for us at TVO tonight and welcome you up here to the province of Ontario.
Thank you, Steve. It's my pleasure.
Let me share this number with you. You know it already, but I'll share it with our viewers. There were, according to the United Nations, 191 million migrants worldwide in the year 2005, the last year for which numbers are available. In 2008, tell me where you think people are going.
Well, where they're trying to go is to Europe and to North America primarily.
When you say trying to go, why do you put it that way?
Well, because a lot of Europe, a lot of the Europeans, particularly Spaniards and the British, that have taken the majority, I would imagine, of all migrants to Europe in the past 6 or 7 years, together with the Irish. They've been getting a bit of a buyer's remorse, as it were. Plus, of course, their economies have been tanking, so there is an awful lot of concern about what to do with some of those people who are now unemployed.
So that's where they're going. Where are they coming from mostly?
They're coming from, you know, in terms of Europe, it is, you know, the top half of Africa, but also parts of the east of the end of the European Union, and of course in the United States, people are coming from Mexico and Central America.
Sure.
Now, to Canada and everything else through the regular legal immigration system, most people come from either Latin America or Asia. Any
new trends in particular that you've noticed lately?
Yes, increasingly there is a trend that has to do an awful lot with the kinds of immigrants that we want, the rich societies, which is sort of the fancy immigrants, highly skilled.
Everybody wants them.
Everybody wants them. There is, you know, there's lust, I mean, literal lust. In fact, the European Union ministers agreed yesterday on the outlines of something that they call a blue card, which will be their entry into the international sweepstakes for the most highly talented. And of course, what we need may not necessarily be the people that we want. We mostly need people who will do, you know, run-of-the-mill kind of work that we no longer aspire to in the rich societies.
That's a very nice way of putting it. You're basically saying the worst, the lousiest, the hardest jobs that no one here wants to do anymore.
I'm glad you said that.
Okay. The United States, I think it's fair to say, has always been, you know, destination #1 for people who are emigrating. That is still the land of milk and honey. I'm wondering whether you see a future where, because of the nature of their growth rates, maybe China or India supplant the U.S. as a place to go because there will be jobs.
This is one of the smartest questions that anybody would ever ask. And you really have to look a bit into the future, 10 or 15 years from now. But certainly in terms of talent migration, the highly skilled, it is at least as likely that much emigration or much immigration in the, let's say by 2025 or so, is going to be toward those places because they have just about all of the elements for attracting immigrants. They have capital, it's mostly our capital, but it's theirs too. They have lots of talent, and talent follows talent. They realize that they have to open up, so they welcome not only their own people coming back, but of course immigrants from all over the different places, and opportunity in which we continue to have an advantage here in North America. In other words, the return that people get in the investments that they made in their own human capital, education and all that, opportunity may shift a little bit.
Let me follow up on the third thing you said, which is this notion of a welcome mat being out. Many people like Canada and the United States because this is not a, these are very diverse countries. These are not countries that are homogeneous. You know, China really isn't a very diverse country. Do you think the welcome mat will be out to people from very different ethnic backgrounds?
Not for the regular Chinese society, but what they're going to do is essentially create platforms, create special cities for immigrants, you know, where they can have just about everything else that they can have in our country. So it's not regular immigration into China where they spread out throughout China, but in specific places. And many people may find it attractive.
So a guest worker kind of program?
A guest worker, yeah. I don't see, you know, sort of people gaining Chinese nationality or what have you, but long-term guest worker, which incidentally may also be the trend for many of the other societies because, you know, sort of the distinctions between permanent and temporary are no longer as clear as they used to be.
Let me read you a comment from The Economist magazine that it published earlier this year. Some would like to see the establishment of a new international body along the lines of a World Trade Organization or to give more powers to the United Nations' existing International Organization for Migration. What kind of a difference, potentially, would this new special organization have?
Can I challenge the...
You don't like the premise?
No, the premise. No, I don't like it. It's that I don't think, that it's anywhere in our future, not in the next 10 or 15 years. The International Organization for Migration exists primarily to serve the interests of about a dozen or a dozen and a half countries that want an agency that will basically do their bidding, move people around, walk in an emergency and, sort of do whatever sweeping up needs to be done. And the primary donors there, which is the United States and a handful of other countries, do not want the International Organization for Migration to get involved in migration policy or code of conducts and things like that. The UN has a body that is called, or an effort that's called the Global Forum on Migration and Development. It is explicitly intergovernmental as a means of avoiding UN engagement on these issues. So for the foreseeable future, we may see subgroups of states getting together and agreeing to certain principles, but I don't see, a world body of any type being developed.
Gotcha. I want to follow up on something we talked about just a few moments ago, this notion of people coming here to do jobs that, we who have been here for a while don't want to do anymore. Plus skilled workers, for that matter. Does the emigration of skilled workers from the developing world hurt the developing world?
Yes, it does. I mean, not every country that is developing, but clearly, if we zero-sum, selection of skilled immigrants from a place, I don't know, like Botswana, and we take, most or a very significant proportion of the medical personnel and nursing personnel that they produce, that has an adverse effect.
But because the conventional wisdom I hear is it's actually good for both. Good in the short run for us because we get that skill here. Good for them also because they'll send money home, and eventually they will go home and help their society, and they'll be, they have the advantage of their experience here in the new world. Is that fair?
Well, it's certainly the first premise. It's good for us. It's probably true. It's also good for the immigrant. And it is good, and here's the second premise, for the families and households of the immigrants who actually move. So far we can agree as to whether it's good for the broader economy there or not. In the long term, it might be, particularly if you have spillover effects from remittances and things like that. But fundamentally, people tend to stay where they go rather than move back and forth, although back and forth movement is going to increase in the future.
How come?
People don't like to sort of the most, desirable people like to go where they think that they can actually get the best returns on their investments. So this is a very mobile, but a very, very small part of all immigration. So they may come here for 5 years, go to the States for another 5, go to a third place, and then they may indeed make an investment and go and follow that investment over there, back to their home country, while really moving back and forth. India, of course, is a perfect example of this. Now, whether, again, this will apply to Nigeria or other places, or how long we may have to wait for that, it's a different story. I can't see that far into the future.
Well, I can give you a good list of countries here, and I should mention before I forget, you are in town to speak to a symposium of healthcare workers at the University of Toronto, so we're grateful that they let you out of your responsibilities there for a little while to come talk to us. But I think of places like Ireland and Greece and Italy, which of course have sent workers overseas to us for many, many decades, and now these are desirable locations for nationals from other part of the world looking for work. How are these countries coping with their new status as sort of places for other people to go, not just for places that lose workers?
It's a very uneven experience. They're trying to sort of try to fix the highway system, as it were, while at the same time more people are trying to travel the roads. So they don't have legislation, that's more recent than, a few years old. They really don't have the administrative structures to manage a system. They're trying to realize that a lot of these people will stay, so they're trying to develop integration measures. This way they can welcome the children, et cetera, et cetera. And they're trying to adapt their legislation as fast as they can. Some of them are doing better, Ireland perhaps, and some of them are doing worse. Greece is struggling, but it's making progress. But think of what we're talking about. We're talking about countries that for 100 years saw themselves and built institutions that said emigration, which is manage the movement of people leaving our country to go somewhere else. And then by historical standards, in no time, in the last 10 years, not only they continue to have the movement back and forth of their own people, but got massive new numbers of immigrants from places that they have hardly ever heard of. And they're trying to manage that transition. And again, I have to give them credit for actually not collapsing under all of this. But they're really struggling to try to maintain, you know, the kind of infrastructure that they need to build in order to take advantage of the opportunities that migration creates.
An odd question here. Did the Olympics make a difference to Greece in terms of being a destination for immigrants?
They certainly built the stadiums.
It did that, didn't it?
They did that.
Anything beyond that?
Not necessarily, not much, because, you know, the economy took a dive right after the Olympics. So, you know, economics is always a big driver of both immigration and emigration.
Well, it's a good question about whether people, when they go, actually stay. And of course, in this country, in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, still, I'm sure, we saw big exoduses from Hong Kong and from China, people coming here all over the West. Do most people who do that stay?
Most people do stay, but, you know, not as many people as used to stay. For instance, in the case of Canada with the Hong Kong Chinese, you know, and regular Chinese, you know, the flow is the other direction. And in American universities, you know, I talk to university presidents and deans and all that. Many of the students that a mere 10 or 15 years ago would stay in the United States, from Korea, from Japan, from China and all that, most of the students now go back. So we are seeing, you know, sort of more of a back and forth movement for the most talented people and the educated people. But most of the poor people that will come to our countries want to stay, and they want to bring the rest of their family to our countries.
Let me ask you about your adopted homeland. You're, of course, originally from Greece and now live in the United States. The United States has a real split personality when it comes to dealing with this issue, don't they? On the one hand, they need even illegal immigrants to do the jobs that people won't do. On the other hand, it's a huge political issue for them. How does this issue, in your view, affect the United States in economic terms?
Well, fundamentally, it's immigrants are needed. They do all the jobs that the overwhelming majority of Americans, you know, do not want to do. They're completely part of American communities with their families, et cetera, et cetera. They're part and parcel of who we are. And the United States has never had the view about immigration that you find in Australia or in Canada. We've never been essentially committed to immigration. We've always been completely two-minded about it. And I mean virtually all immigration.
I would say hostile, based on what I see on U.S. television.
I will buy that. Certainly hostile toward, you know, both illegal immigration, but also all of the people who look like the illegals, in other words, who come from the same countries. And you're right, we have lost our way, and we're unable to actually have a decent conversation about how to get ourselves out of the hole that we have created for ourselves.
Can you imagine your country actually building like a concrete wall across the Mexican border to keep people out?
You're trying to make me feel really bad. I feel bad about it.
You don't have to take responsibility for it. I'm sure it's not your idea.
I certainly, but you know, I think it offends an awful lot of people. And, you know, adding insult to injury to all of this, we all know, including the people who built these walls, that we're going to have to spend more of our treasure 10, 15 years down from now to take it down. And these walls are very expensive to take down. They're very expensive to put up and very expensive to take down.
Well, having said that, there is a sizable illegal immigrant population in the United States right now. And of course, not so much now, but earlier in this presidential campaign cycle, it was a big deal, particularly among the Republicans. What do you think ought to be done about that?
Well, you know, everybody is in agreement as to what must be done as a policy issue. We must legalize virtually all of the people who are here, because if you do something that is half-hearted in that regard, you're simply going to leave a nucleus behind that's simply going to grow, and illegality will continue to penetrate, you know, the political psyche in the United States. And we have to completely revise our immigration system. You folks keep passing legislation, reforming, changing, trying to adapt the system. We haven't touched the system virtually since 1965. Tell me, in what part of human endeavor or management system can you try to work, you know, in the 21st century with a system and a set of ideas that you created back in 1965?
Why do you think it's such a hot button still?
Because, for many reasons. Part of it is that Americans get offended if you tell them that they're jobs that they simply don't want to do. So they argue that, yeah, we don't want to do them at the wages being offered. And the sort of the essence of the system, the American system, which is family immigration, is so deeply embedded in the psyche of the American, you know, the American electorate, and has created such large constituencies that you can't even shift it in order to make it more responsive to families being together. We have a family system that takes up 60 or 7% of our visas, yet it keeps spouses and minor children apart for 4 or 5 or 6 years. We have over 1.3 million people who are spouses and minor children waiting on waiting lines to come and join their parents or the other spouse. That simply makes no sense. It contributes to illegality, etc., etc.
'Twas ever thus, though, wasn't it? I mean, certainly Russian immigrants who came here 100 years ago, Dad used to come first and then years later would send for his wife and children?
Yeah, again, absolutely right, it was. But today's people have a different set of expectations, I suspect. We estimate that a large proportion, a significant proportion, of the 12 million people who are in the United States illegally as we speak are in some theoretical way waiting on some line for an American visa to be available.
Let me ask you one last question, because we're in the midst of an election campaign in this country, and interestingly enough, immigration, which is usually a very hot topic, has really not come up very much, which is why we're going to discuss it next. How do you think we're doing?
You're doing certainly better than the United States, but that's not high praise. I think that you're innovative. Again, you know, there was a period of time where you had lost sort of the urge to innovate. I think you're taking some chances, and I'm not quite sure, you know, that this will necessarily pan out. But there is an awful lot of evaluation research that's happening in Canada, and the willingness to try to be as fleet-footed as the system requires you to be. So I think that you're doing, I'd give you certainly, you know, a B or B plus in this, right up there with Australia, perhaps in the UK.
Well, I like your expression that illegal immigration is part of the vital lubricant of our societies. Some people like vital lubricants and some people don't, so we're going to continue our discussion on the other side of the studio. Demetri, it's good to meet you, and thanks so much for visiting us at TVO tonight.
It's my pleasure. Very nice meeting you, Steve.